I was walking along the fog-drenched streets near the old docks in San Francisco, the kind of morning when the air tastes like salt and rust. The city was just waking up. Gulls circling over the Bay Bridge, the distant clang of a trolley bell echoing through the mist. I work nights for animal control, and after years of calls about strays and accidents, I thought I'd grown numb. But that morning proved me wrong. I heard it first. A faint, broken whimper coming from beneath a collapsed wooden pier. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks. Then it came again. Soft, weak, but real. I knelt down and peered through the lattice of splintered boards. My flashlight beam caught movement, not trash, not a rat, but a trembling shape wedged between driftwood and old fishing nets. He was a German Shepherd puppy, maybe 5 months old, his classic black and tan coat caked in oily mud and salt. His paws were raw from scraping against barnacles, and his fur hung in sticky clumps, heavy with seawater. He looked up at me, too tired to bark, eyes glazed but pleading, as if he'd been waiting for someone to notice. The tide was rising, foam licking closer to his body. I dropped to my knees, calling softly, trying to sound steady while my heart raced. "Hey, buddy, it's okay." The wooden boards creaked under me as I reached in. When my fingers brushed his wet fur, he flinched but didn't pull away. That's when I knew he'd stopped believing anyone would come. I didn't think, I just acted. I pushed deeper under the pier, ignoring the sting of salt water and splinters, knowing this was the moment, the line between being found and being lost forever. The tide had reached my knees by the time I managed to wedge my arm far enough beneath the pier to slip the loop of a leash around his neck. He didn't fight, didn't even tremble, just stared, hollow-eyed, as if surrendering to whatever came next. When I pulled, his frail body slid forward across the slick wood, paws dragging, fur heavy with seawater. For a second, I thought he'd given up entirely, until I felt the faintest resistance, a weak attempt to stand. That tiny spark was enough to keep me going. When we finally stumbled out from under the pier, the daylight hit him fully. His coat, beneath all that grime, was the deep, rich color of burnt caramel and soot. Strands of seaweed clung to his legs, and his tail hung lifeless. He tried to take a step toward me, but collapsed onto the wet pavement, breathing in short, raspy bursts. I wrapped him in my jacket, it smelled of coffee and city smoke, and pressed him close against my chest. His heartbeat was faint but steady, a fragile rhythm against the roar of the ocean behind us. A fisherman nearby called out, asking if he was alive. I could only nod, already running toward my truck parked by the wharf. Each step echoed in my ears, water sloshing in my boots, the dog's shallow breathing barely audible under my coat. As I reached the door, he gave a soft, guttural sound, almost a whine, almost a question. "It's okay," I whispered as I laid him on the seat. "You're safe now." But as I turned the key, I couldn't help wondering if I was already too late. Traffic blurred around me as I sped through the morning streets, the city's hum barely cutting through the sound of his ragged breathing beside me. Every red light felt like a threat. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on his side, feeling each shallow rise and fall. The heater blew warm air, but his body stayed cold, trembling beneath my soaked jacket. The vet clinic was still 15 minutes away, but I couldn't wait. I pulled into a gas station, grabbed a towel from the back seat, and began rubbing his fur, trying to stir some warmth back into him. His eyes flickered open, deep brown, glassy but aware. When I spoke, his ears twitched ever so slightly. "Hang in there, buddy. You've got this." My voice cracked more than I wanted it to. As I dried him, layers of dirt gave way to something heartbreakingly beautiful. That unmistakable German Shepherd mask, the black saddle pattern cutting through the tan. Underneath the grime, he was just a puppy, someone's lost companion, someone who had once been loved, or should have been. When I got him back in the truck, he shifted for the first time, curling slightly toward the seat's warmth. A sound escaped him, not quite a cry, not quite a sigh, more like the first exhale after fear. I knew then he wanted to live. By the time the vet's sign appeared through the mist, his eyes were closing again. I honked twice, jumped out, and shouted for help before the door even shut. "He's still breathing," I called out, "but I don't know for how long." They rushed him inside, the vet and 2 techs moving fast, their voices calm but sharp with urgency. The fluorescent lights felt too bright after the gray harbor fog. I stood dripping on the tile floor, salt water pooling around my boots, watching them lift his limp body onto the metal table. He looked so small there, his fur still damp and tangled, his ribs faintly visible under the light. 5 months, maybe? The vet murmured, checking his gums, listening to his chest. Severely dehydrated, probably days without food. She met my eyes briefly, and I saw what she didn't say out loud. It could go either way. They inserted an IV, wrapped him in blankets, and began warming fluids. His paw twitched, barely perceptible, when the needle slid in. I stood close, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to move. There's something unbearable about silence in a room like that. Only the soft beeping of machines and the faint hum of the heater. When she asked for a name for the chart, I hesitated. "Not yet," I said. "Let's see if he makes it through the night." She nodded and placed her hand gently on his neck, feeling for the slow, uneven pulse. I sat on the cold floor beside the table for hours, listening to the city fade outside. Sirens, footsteps, foghorns. Every so often I'd reach out and touch the edge of the blanket, just enough for him to feel I was there. And when his paw twitched again, stronger this time, I whispered, "That's it. Stay with me." By midnight, the tremors had eased. His breathing deepened, steadier, as if the city's noise finally gave him permission to rest. I didn't go home that night. The vet offered a cot in the corner of the recovery room, but I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I sat there beside his crate, the hum of the oxygen machine and the soft rhythm of his breathing filling the silence. Outside, San Francisco was quiet for once. The kind of fog-soaked stillness that makes the whole city feel like it's holding its breath. By dawn, the first golden light spilled through the blinds. He stirred. A slow blink, a shallow stretch, the smallest flick of an ear. It wasn't much, but it felt monumental. When I knelt beside him, his gaze found mine, clearer this time, less fear, more question. I dipped my hand inside the crate, palm open, and waited. After a long pause, he pressed his nose against my fingers. Warm, trusting, fragile. The vet came in soon after, smiling faintly. "He's stable," she said. "You pulled him out just in time." She handed me a small bowl of water. I held it under his muzzle, and after a moment's hesitation, he began to drink. Slow, careful laps that broke me in ways I didn't expect. When he finished, I whispered, "Good boy," and his tail moved once, barely brushing the blanket. That small, trembling wag was the first sign of life beyond survival, the first flicker of hope. I sat back and exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath since the pier. For the first time, the fear that he might not make it began to loosen its grip. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I wasn't walking away. Over the next few days, the clinic became our whole world, a small room filled with antiseptic air, soft towels, and the quiet pulse of recovery. I learned his rhythms, the way he twitched in sleep, the soft whine he made when the IV line tugged, the tiny flinch that still surfaced whenever someone moved too fast. He'd been hurt by people before, that much was clear. But every hour I stayed, I felt the wall between us thinning. On the third morning, he stood for the first time. It was clumsy. His legs shook under his weight, his paws splayed wide on the tile, but he stayed up. I caught myself whispering encouragement like a parent to a child. "That's it. Easy. You've got this." The vet smiled from across the room. "He's stubborn," she said. "That's a good sign." I spent most of that day beside him, brushing the dried salt and mud from his fur. Beneath the grime, his coat started to gleam, that deep, classic black and tan pattern of a young German shepherd coming back to life. With every stroke of the brush, I felt the city's noise fade into the distance. The sirens, the traffic, the restless rush of people who would never know this story. When the vet finally removed the IV, he took 2 wobbly steps toward me, then stopped and looked up. His eyes were clearer now, alert but gentle. I held out my hand, and he pressed his forehead against my palm, a small, deliberate gesture of trust. That's when I said it out loud for the first time. "You made it," I whispered. "You're safe, kid." And for a moment, in that quiet room above the city, it felt true. By the end of the week, he could walk across the room without stumbling. Every step looked like a victory, careful and proud, as if he knew he was reclaiming something that had once been his. Strength, balance, maybe even dignity. I'd come every morning before work and every night after my shift, carrying chicken broth or an old towel that smelled like home. The staff had started calling him the pier dog, but to me, he was becoming something more. A quiet reminder of why I ever took this job in the first place. One evening, the city outside was glowing orange with sunset, the windows of the clinic catching fire with light. I sat cross-legged beside him, tracing lazy circles on the tile with my finger. He watched me closely, ears flicking every time I said something. I realized I'd been talking to him for hours. About nothing, about everything. About the fog, the docks, the sound of seagulls at dawn. And somewhere in that rambling, I found myself saying, "You need a name, don't you?" He tilted his head and I laughed softly. "How about Bay?" I said, glancing toward the window. "You came from the water, after all." His tail moved once, deliberate, as if answering. "Bay it is," I whispered. That night, when I left, he barked, just once. A small hoarse sound, but it followed me out the door and stayed in my chest the whole drive home. For the first time since that morning under the pier, I didn't feel alone in the city. The next time I came in, Bay was waiting by the gate instead of lying on his blanket. The moment he saw me, he let out a low, eager sound, half whine, half greeting, and pressed his paws against the bars. His eyes were alive now, sharp and golden in the morning light. The difference was staggering. The broken creature I'd pulled from the tide had turned into something steady, curious, full of quiet defiance. We started short walks outside the clinic, just a few steps along the sidewalk. The fog rolled in off the bay, wrapping us in soft gray, the smell of salt still clinging to his fur. He moved cautiously at first, paws hesitant on the concrete, but soon his stride grew more confident. Each time I said his name, his ears flicked and his tail lifted a little higher. "Good boy, Bay," I'd say, and he'd glance back at me with that spark, like he finally believed the words were meant for him. People passing by would stop to look. "Beautiful dog," one woman said. I nodded, smiling. "Yeah," I murmured, "he's something special." But what I didn't say was how fragile that beauty still was, how every moment felt borrowed, stitched together by trust and patience. Back inside, the vet checked his weight, her face softening. "He's ready to go home soon," she said. I looked at Bay, his head resting against my knee, and realized home wasn't a place anymore. It was this, a heartbeat, a name, and a promise I couldn't break. A week later, I signed the papers. The clinic doors opened and Bay stepped out beside me, not as a patient, but as mine. The morning was bright, the kind of San Francisco day that feels like a reward after weeks of fog. His fur gleamed under the sunlight, deep black fading into warm tan around his legs and chest. He walked with purpose now, tail level, head high, yet every few steps he'd glance back at me, as if to make sure this was real. We drove through the city with the windows down. The wind whipped through his fur, and for the first time, he stuck his nose out and closed his eyes, just feeling the air. It was such a simple thing, but I had to blink hard to keep from crying. The same pup who once lay motionless under the pier was now leaning into the wind, free. At home, he hesitated on the threshold. The sound of my old clock ticked through the quiet, and I could see him sniffing every corner, cautious but curious. I set down a clean blanket, not a cage, not a clinic towel, and patted it once. "Come on, Bay," I said softly. He stepped forward, circled twice, then settled down with a long exhale that sounded almost human. That night, he slept without flinching. No twitching paws, no sudden jerks, just peace. I stayed awake for a while, listening to his steady breathing filling the apartment, realizing how long it had been since my home had felt alive. Outside, the city murmured below the window, the same city that had nearly swallowed him whole, and now, somehow, had given us both a second chance. Morning sunlight poured through the window, cutting across the floor in soft golden lines. Bay was already awake, sitting by the glass, ears perked toward the sounds of the street. Children laughing, a cable car bell, gulls circling above the bay. His coat shimmered now, thick and healthy, not a trace of the grime or fear that once clung to him. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were calm, not pleading anymore, just full of quiet trust. We fell into a rhythm, the kind that only time and care can build. Morning walks along the Embarcadero, afternoons in the park where he'd chase the wind instead of ghosts. People would stop us, asking how old he was, where I'd found him. I'd smile and say, "He found me first," and Bay would nudge my hand like he understood. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Golden Gate, we returned to the docks, the same place where it all began. The tide was low, the pier still broken, but the air felt different. Bay walked ahead, sniffing the air, tail high and confident. I watched him step close to the water's edge, where waves once threatened to take him, and he simply sat, looking out at the endless blue. I knelt beside him, resting my hand on his back. The fur was warm, solid, alive. "You made it, Bay," I whispered. He turned, pressing his head against my shoulder, the same way he had that first day in the clinic. In the distance, the fog began to roll in again, soft and slow, wrapping the city in silver light. But this time it didn't feel cold. It felt like home.